Welcome to Microscope, a series of in-depth, critical, comprehensive, and informative conversations about issues that really matter in community. No scripts, no written questions, minimal or no editing. This is what journalism does best. Join me, Steve Betchkel, as we sit down and get down to the matter at hand. First of all, what are you doing these days here at the university?
Well, I am a senior lecturer here at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire in the education department. And every semester I teach 3 sections of children's literature, which covers books from birth through the middle school years. And all of my students are elementary students or special ed students. And then I have one section of literature for adolescents, which is also known as young adult literature, which is a very popular genre today. And that is mostly for middle school and high school future educators. So that takes up the bulk of my time, and in between I do a lot of writing and for my own purposes and also for the class.
Now I'm going to put this out there, but I think that as far as civic responsibilities go, probably the 2 most important things I can think of are voting and reading to kids.
I'll agree with that one. Yeah, reading for kids is so important, and study after study just shows that kids who are read to, even when they learn how to read, this is what a lot of people stop doing. Is when they learn to read, they think, well, they can read on their own. But if you read aloud to kids, they usually come out ahead in all aspects of life, and usually just kind of like education-wise and imagination-wise, reading is so valuable. I'm a big disciple of Jim Trelease, who wrote a book called The Read Aloud Handbook. He recently retired, but I think it went through 6 or 7 editions, and I let my students know about this book too, because if they ever need evidence in terms of research for a administrator, say, or someone else who wonders if reading aloud is a waste of time, this book has all that evidence as well as lists of good books to read aloud. And when I said I'm kind of a disciple of him, then I've taken up where he's left off with his retirement and written several books too, pointing out to adults, parents, teachers, librarians mostly, which books are excellent, whether they're picture books or chapter books or nonfiction books, to read aloud to kids.
Mm-hmm. Now, wait a minute here. You've actually got you're in your arsenal, you're saying you might need to prove to somebody that reading?
Yes, unfortunately, that's the way it is. A lot of times people just don't think that reading is that valuable. And a lot of times you have to convince the kids who would rather be off doing other things that reading can be a part of their life. And I think if you read to kids, that's just going to get them more interested in learning to read themselves. It really helps literacy. And that's kind of what I said before about don't stop when they learn how to read, because it's just going to keep inspiring them to keep going with reading. So yes, there are some people that think that as if you can read an instructional manual and that's enough reading in their lives, but we know better.
Do you think they've forgotten what it's like to be a kid? Because I've never met a kid who didn't like a good story.
Well, I have. I've met those kids, and it's sometimes it's a challenge to win them over. And I'd say that I'm usually pretty successful in finding the right passage to read to them, or the right book. But yes, I agree. I think that a lot of times the adults forget what it's like to be a kid and the joy of reading as well. They might have had a bad experience. Maybe they had a person in their life who forced them to read something that they weren't ready for. That's usually one of the deterrents to becoming a lifelong reader, is that we tend to turn reading into homework, and you read something and then we test you on that. That'll kill the love of reading right there several times. A lot of times what we do is we'll give them something that is way above their maturity level because it's a classic book, for example. And so one of my jobs is to try to let my students know that here's a good book for this age group, usually within a 2 or 3 or 4 year age range, and here's some other good books too. So yeah, it is a constant uphill battle. So that's why I always try to tell my students to kind of keep on the alert for not only books that they read when they were kids and they were familiar with, but also kind of keep up with the current crop. I think we're just in another golden age of both children's literature and young adult literature right now. Quality books being written left and right.
All right, I'm going to return to that thought, but I want to follow up on this, and I want to qualify. If you're talking about very young children who haven't had the experience ruined for them, is there such a thing as a kid that doesn't like a story?
Sometimes it has to do with their development, and so it might be that they find it challenging to sit still and listen. So once again, if you find the right thing, and sometimes it might be that you're going for broad humor or something that might be a little scary for them to kind of hook them. Usually it has something to do with a very interesting character that they can either relate to or want to know more about.
All right, and I want color me a little skeptical here, but you said this is a golden age of literature. I mean, books have been around forever, great books. Has there ever been a time where there haven't been great books that you could draw from? That's a good question. I believe that every generation's kind of got their wonderful books that are out there. What I meant today is another golden age is it's that there are more options of what stories are out there, mostly in terms of diversity, where we hear voices from people we hadn't heard before, whether they're with an ethnic minority group or if they have a disability or the LGBTQ community. We're hearing more from those voices instead of middle class, white, Ramona of the Past, Henry Huggins stuff, which are great books, but when you and I were kids, those were basically what was available. Yeah.
You know?
So at one time maybe talking animals was the thing. Now diversity really is in.
It really is, and you know, we're still in the after effects of the whole Harry Potter phenomenon, which I believe too. So with Harry, that kind of made reading cool again for another generation, and so that kind of re-sparked a big interest in children's books. So that because there's a lot of people that look down upon children's books, they think, oh, they have to teach a moral lesson. No, they don't. The lesson could be reading is fun. We're having a good time, or that it's not good literature. You know, it's dumbed down literature, and so that kind of put the spotlight back on literature to reveal that there is a lot of what I call subtle sophistication going on in there, and then also that that has come into, I'd say, the last decade or so of more diversity. The overall percentage of diversity books is still kind of low, but there has been, in my career, I'd say my 30-year career here, I've seen different waves of efforts to get diversity, the publishers to create more books from diverse perspectives. And I think this time it's finally hooked on because we have a lot of attention to award winners, or the big awards like Newbery, Caldecott. There are more books featuring people of color and other aspects of diversity out there being recognized, and specific awards as well. We're seeing them on the bestseller list finally too, which has taken a long time. For example, the book Wonder.
Not familiar with that.
It's about a boy who has a facial deformity. They just made a movie of it. When that book was published a few years back, it made an instant splash, and it's still on the bestseller list. So we hadn't seen that, I'd say, a decade ago. It was more the talking animals and white community.
Is part of this issue that young black kids, young Latino kids need more exposure to good books and need more exposure to parents reading to them? How would you interpret that?
Yes. What we use in the classes is the Windows mirror metaphor. And so the Windows metaphor is that you're reading about someone who's not like you to learn more about them. The mirror metaphor is that you're reading someone who's like you. And a lot of kids of color hadn't found that before. I teach Sherman Alexie, Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, in my adolescent class. And he said, I didn't know Indians could write in interviews, you know, and so because he never read, he didn't hear about that, he didn't see himself in the books. Christopher Paul Curtis, African American author, said there were no books about kids like me when I was growing up. So it is very important. It's a self-identity type of thing. We also talk about a term called bibliotherapy, where you experience assistance or help in growing up. If you read someone about yourself, that kind of help you give you cues about how to survive in life or to get through life. It's a healing type of process too, and so that helps a lot.
Is there any such thing, in your opinion, if books have to go through a very strenuous filter to get published? I mean, it's very hard.
It's very hard, yeah.
Is there such a thing? Have you seen books that you would think, oh my God, they shouldn't be saying that, or they shouldn't be promoting that, or I don't believe this got through the filter, and that, you know, that are popular books that have made it? Have you ever seen anything like that? Or all popular books great books?
No, they're not. A lot of times they're just they follow a formula, kind of like movies. You know, you could tell which are great movies, which not all popular movies are great. Okay, so it's kind of the same way with books too. I know a lot of people love the Berenstain Bears. I have Berenstain Bear books at my house, the kids with them. But if you read the words, they're kind of clunky. You know, the text is kind of clunky, the illustrations are fairly flat, yet they're extremely popular. And a lot of people focus on those formula type of books, and there's so many other good ones out there that have a little higher quality in both the writing and maybe the format and the creativity and the story that's going on. So that's a big job, is to try to to find the really good stuff out there too. As far as I see a book that comes out and I go, oh, there shouldn't be a book like that. I'm more a little pro-intellectual freedom, and so I hate to think that anybody wants to censor anything. So I'm usually defending those books. If there's a book about, like I Am Jazz is a popular book that features a transgender character in a picture book format. So, of course, there's a lot of people that don't think that's appropriate for kids, and so that one appears on American Library Association's banned books, you know, the most banned books of the year type of a thing. Book? Yes, yeah. There's more LGBTQ books for different age levels now than there were before. There are two children's books from last year's list that have Muslim characters, and just the fact that it's a Muslim theme irritates some people, and so they don't want those books. Harry Potter was the most challenged series in the early 2000s for 4 years in a row, and that's become the norm now. It's such status quo. You know, we have Harry Potter theme parks, and the kids today that I have in my class who are in their 20s, and Harry Potter's 20 years old, a lot of them have a hard time understanding why people found them objectionable back 20 years ago.
Explain to me why they did. Was it a different take on religion?
It was perceived by a lot of people that way. What happens is when a book wins awards or becomes very popular, the spotlight goes on it, and so it gets a lot of close scrutiny from folks who want to say, this is good for my kids or this is not good for my kids. And a lot of people saw the magic that was going on. They were worried that kids would turn away from the religious beliefs that their family raised them. J.K. Rowling is on record saying, show me one kid who lost their faith after reading Harry Potter, and I think she's still waiting. So it was mostly a big effort because of all the supernatural aspects in it.
I'm sure I've asked you this question before, and you've been asked this question before. I could ask you what your favorite kids' books are, but I'm curious if you remember which were the first books that affected you. Which were the first books that you bonded with?
I remember, when I was in preschool, it was Green Eggs and Ham, Dr. Seuss. My grandparents lived on a farm in Woodward, Iowa, about a half hour from Des Moines. And they would go into town, bring me into town, and the library there, it always kind of amused me as an adult looking back. It was the second floor of a fire department. the fire station was below and the library was above, and I always thought, you know, the stereotype of a library is shh, be quiet, and here's the alarm bells going. And I kept checking out Green Eggs and Ham over and over and over, and I'm sure my grandma was going, why don't you pick other books? But that's a trait that kids like to do, is they like to get familiar with that. In school, then once I got rid of there, moved on from the picture books, I found the Beverly Cleary books. And back then it was Henry Huggins and Ribsy books. But then I dived into biographies. I read biographies of presidents, of sports figures, and I was kind of stuck on that for a while. I shouldn't say stuck on that. That was what I really enjoyed. I read comic books, I read Mad Magazine. My parents even they said, we're worried about you reading so many comic books, and they said you can read comic books as long as you read, quote, good literature. And for them, Hardy Boys passed the test. And, you know, Hardy Boys is another formula type of book that the quality of the writing isn't the greatest, but it has enough in it to attract kids. So that was kind of the deal I made with them. So those were some of the early influences I had. As an adult now, I've been reading children's books. I got into children's literature when I was in grad school to get my library science master's degree. And my oldest daughter was born that first semester, and it was like a shift in my head. I said, why don't I go into children's services, because that's what I really know and enjoy. And since then, Holes by Louis Sachar is kind of my favorite children's novel. I like the picture book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. I think that's a nice crafted one. But there's always good ones coming out there, and I always excited to kind of share those with everybody.
When we had books in the house, and we still have them, in the attic somewhere, we probably had 300 kids' books, because we one day think we may have grandkids, and
right.
we have those around, all those classic books. There were certain books that I loved to read. I would get into the voices of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
What is it, Gregory? The Terrible Eater? What was it?
Yeah, Gregory the Terrible Eater.
And so we make our voices sound like goats.
Right.
But there are certain books, too, that my kids would say, oh, read that one again. So you have to hide those books, because I got so tired of reading those books.
I know. I think every parent who reads to their kids goes, oh, do I have to read this one more time? Yeah.
Right. Bringing the Rain to Kapiti Plains was one that repeated itself, and I didn't enjoy reading it because I had to keep repeating the lines over and over again. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the House That Jack Built type of books, because then you have to go back and recite the same refrain back and forth, and it's kind of a zipper type of story. So, but books are kind of a gateway drug for young people, because not only, as you said, I mean, they are getting their brain going. They're learning about themselves. They're learning this very useful skill of reading and perhaps of expression, and later maybe writing themselves.
Yep.
All these things are so important down the line that by reading to them early, we are really exposing them to this kind of addiction.
And we're modeling for them as well. I liked what you said just a few minutes ago about getting into the voices and everything. I talked to parents who said, well, I'm not really that, demonstrative or really good at voices. And I say, that's okay. You don't have to, have a different voice for every character. Just have enthusiasm. I think if you're excited about the story, then that'll kind of translate to kids. And a lot of times if you have a lot of characters and you have a different voice for Mr. Fox and a different voice and then you mix them up, the kids are going to nail you with those too. So I usually do like a grandma with maybe just a little bit shift in voice instead of a real broad stereotype.
I can't remember the one book. There was a story where this kid has the pen comes alive and it writes, and the ink jar comes alive and it writes, but we used to have voices for that one too. And I can't even remember the name of it now, it's so long ago. But another great one, Horton Hears a Who. Had a lot of different characters in that one.
Yeah.
When you look at books, the story is, to me, usually the thing. I love page turners.
Yeah.
And yes, okay, I was in that same phase. I've read a lot of biographies. I learned a lot about science and reading. I read about bees and bugs and birds and all these things. That
I always had a rocks and mineral identification book ready to go.
But the story, I really come back to the story idea. That the story to me is what grabs me about reading. And so, yeah, I can read a nonfiction book, but I'll always come back to the page turner. So what's your reflection on on that craft about a good storyteller and what a good storyteller, the knack of the storyteller and what they have and that gift and what they bring to the table. What, you have a lot of perspective on storytelling.
Well, it's very important. I think that what very successful writers will often try to come up with new plots. Plot is difficult to hook on a character. I think hand in hand with the story is the character. Character development is just as important, and I think the two go hand in hand. I'm going to go back to Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. I think she's a marvelous writer. And not only did she have those plot twists, and for a person who's read a lot of stuff over the years, I never knew where she was going with the story. She was able to keep me hooked that way. But to develop such marvelous characters to get into those situations, I think is the mark of a really strong writer. And get away from stereotypes, or have well-rounded characters is just as important as having a gripping story. But as far as the action goes, that's kids usually. I think what I try to teach my students is find out what kids like and kind of find out what's available in that area there. And so we kind of break it down into maybe realistic fiction. What realistic fiction do they like? Is it outdoor survival stories like the Gary Paulson books, where a child is in some kind of situation, a flood perhaps, or stuck out in the woods? How are they going to get back? Maybe it's a fantasy or science fiction where they're in a different world, but again, it's kind of like reflective of growing up in our world too, so they can relate to that. Is it a mystery? Is it a thriller? Is it? But then again, there's some quiet stories too, like friendship stories or stories about school, that type of thing, where they won't be maybe not as much of a page turner, but they'll have some aspect to them that will grab the attention of the kid.
My dad was not a reader. He was rather self-conscious about it, not a very good reader himself.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember one night, it was bedtime, and my dad, who doesn't tell stories, sat down in the dark on that bed and told me a story. And I just remember right now, I don't remember all about it. He must have heard it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And he told it to me, and I thought it was the greatest thing on
Mm-hmm.
earth.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the same thing? Is the story without the print, without the book, does that do the same thing for kids? Because, a parent tells you a great story in the dark at bedtime.
Yeah.
That can grip a child's imagination.
It sure can. Yeah, it's hand in hand with reading aloud, storytelling, oral storytelling. I mean, we're all storytellers. Before there were books, we were telling stories. And I've been a professional storyteller since the early 80s, going out and sharing stories with kids and adults as well. And with the kids, they always are, if they hadn't been exposed to the oral storytelling, there's a little pause there when they realize, oh, he's not showing us a book or reading from a book, he's not showing us pictures. And then once they start listening to the story, something's going on there, and I almost feel like an electric charge from kids that really get hooked on oral storytelling. And so I have an assignment in my children's literature class where my future teachers and librarians have to learn a folk tale, and we start with folk tales because they were first told orally, and so they're kind of groomed for that. And then they have to learn the story. I tell them, don't memorize it word for word. Just every time you tell it, kind of memorize the outline, and then you share the story. The kids become really fascinated with it. We're in competition with kids' attention with electronics right now, and this is kind of like a return to our roots, to be able to share stories like that. And then there's also, if you just want to spin a story off the top of your head, I imagine your dad might have done that too. Sometimes when my kids were little, I would sit on the floor by their bed and just kind of spin something out. Maybe they threw in some suggestions of where the story should go, or I'd say, what's tonight's story about? And they'll say, oh, it's about a dog in the North Pole, So we start there and we start telling a story about a dog in the North Pole just off the top of our heads. The imagination's going, all kinds of things are happening to kids.
Mm-hmm. And so that's interesting because a lot of these oral stories you talk about are really rooted in tradition. They have come from 1,000 years of ancestry where people told them kind of in the same way over and over again.
Yes.
You could take a story and sit down and you could make it up the top of your head, and kids are attracted to that, even though it may not have the same kind of carefully planned plot or flow.
Right. That's okay. Yeah, it's like writing a first draft of something there. You just put it out there, and then if you want, you can craft it later. You can make it better later and maybe turn it into a print book too. There's a few children's authors who are, they got their start in storytelling, and they practiced their story and they honed it with different audiences. Robert Munch, Eric Kimmel, Margaret Reed McDonald are a couple that come to mind. And then once they had the story down, then they sent it off to a publisher, and in their cases, they were able to get them printed there. The other nice thing about storytelling too is that every culture has their own stories. And so if you want to share the diverse world with kids, you can just go to the library. The Dewey Decimal number is 398. And maybe you're going to pick a story that was told in China hundreds of years ago, or South America, or wherever.
Dewey Decimal, boy, I haven't heard that.
Yeah. They still employ that at the public libraries and the school libraries.
Yeah, if you physically are going to the shelves, you gotta use it that way. Yeah?
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's I drill that number in my students' head. 398. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about your own writing history. You've written books. Tell me about your bibliography, your path in writing, what you've done, where you're headed.
Sure. Yeah, I used to write stories and get them rejected and left and right, and then I found a niche audience, which was people in my profession. Before I taught here at the university, I was a librarian, and I wrote some books that were helpful for librarians. The first one was called Children's Jukebox, and it was basically a resource book. It was a subject index of children's recorded music. About that time, I was doing a lot of outreach with local kids, and rap music was starting to come into mainstream. I thought, I should write a library rap, so I wrote several library raps and went out as Rappin Rob for many years. And that first rap actually got printed in a magazine called School Library Journal. And got a big response from librarians all over the country about that. Can we have permission to reprint the lyrics on a bookmark, that type of thing? I did another one after that. One of the raps turned into my picture book, Wave Goodbye. Can I show that one to you here? And this was originally a rap, and it turned into a picture book. So I've had 2 children's picture books published, which were both basically, song lyrics. But most of my books are resource books for librarians, and I do have some publishers I work over and over with there too. So I have some where it's like story program ideas, and I have some books that are good books to share, to read aloud to kids, and those are aimed at parents, librarians, and teachers. So that takes up most of my writing. I write a lot of original children's songs and finger plays and activities, and my current project right now is to take all of those original materials that I've done over the years and put them together in one kind of a greatest hits.
Wait, don't tell me. It's going to be a rock opera.
Package, yeah, right. That's going to be published by ALA Editions in Chicago.
Wonderful.
And my manuscript is due to them in January 2018.
Oh, cool.
So it'll probably come out the following summer. And that's kind of a fun project now. I'm also trying to find a publisher who I've got a reluctant reader series where here's some good books for kids who probably would rather do something besides listen to stories or read. And I'm working on one now that features the best villains in children's literature and how the villains can hook kids how to read. Would you read Harry Potter if He Who Shall Not Be Named, Voldemort, wasn't in it? It wouldn't be the same story. Would Matilda be that exciting if Principal Trunchbull wasn't it, who I think is the funnest villain of all children's literature time there too. So the villains, not necessarily good role models, but they're the spark for the role models to follow. So working on a novel all as well, kind of an adult novel about another end of the war one. There's the other end of the world story. There's a lot of them out there, but
well, you got to have a project, right?
got a project, yeah. So I usually try to find some time each day to write a little bit.
Yeah. Do you personally consider your creativity to be a gift, a value, a treasured gift? I know it sounds a little bit silly question because I see you as that kind of person.
I think it's a desire. It's a desire and a discipline. Not necessarily gift. I don't feel gifted in writing. I feel like it's a craft I have to really work at. I always, when I was younger, like in college, I always told people, yeah, I'm a writer, and then I wouldn't write, you know. Or I'd write something real quick and think, well, that was, you know, here's my genius right here, but I didn't really work on it. And it wasn't until later that I really kind of learned the discipline about being a writer, about getting the words on the page or the computer screen, and then the real writing begins, you know, the recrafting, the editing of it. I'm very fortunate to be in a local writing support group. We meet once a month. We share each other's manuscripts because a lot of times I write a lot for Volume 1 and the Chippewa Valley family. I have a column in there about what it means to be a grandparent in the Chippewa Valley. And so a lot of times I'll share my works with my group. My group is called Wait What? And we're very helpful for each other. I'm very glad that we have the Chippewa Valley Writers Guild going on. That's been a big boon too. It's inspirational. With my writing group, a lot of times I find that even if I didn't agree with their criticism or didn't bring something that month, just the camaraderie, I leave there going, I got to write now. I got to write. So it's kind of an energy thing going.
Would you care to mention the members of the group?
Oh, sure. Eric Rasmussen, who's a Memorial High School teacher, is the one that kind of started it. And we have B.J. Hollers, who's on the faculty here, and Julian Emerson, who writes for the Leader Telegram. Ken Szymanski, also a local teacher. I'm missing a few. Justin Patchen, who teaches here as well. And
talented bunch of folks there.
Bunch of wonderful, honest. We're kind of like no holds barred. We really get into it. Andy Patry, English teacher at North, is in the group as well.
Yeah. Yeah. You hung with the guys. I hung with the women. I hung with the workshop with Yvette Flotten, and Sandy Lindo, and Nina St. Louis, and Peg Lauber.
Oh, yeah.
Same thing.
Very strong writers in our community.
Very good
right.
You bring your stuff in there, and they gave you honest feedback about what you were doing, and you learned a lot from it.
We have Lindsay Brandrup in the group as well. I didn't mean to do it. We've had some other women in the group who have no longer in the group, so I don't know if we repelled them or...
Sounds like fun, though.
Yeah.
Do you think that the list of topics for books is infinite? That anything there's who would have thought Harry Potter? You know, and people say that kind of thing. Oh, the next Harry Potter. Yeah. As if. And there were a lot
of imitation books afterwards. Well, Percy Jackson books is a Harry Potter, but it's with a mythology.
But it's like people think, well, there's an unfound idea out there. That if you just can find that load and tap into that load, you'll have this great idea.
Yeah, I really don't think so. I kind of along the lines of the old cliche. There's X number of plots out there, and we're telling the same stories over and over, maybe with different angles. So I think we're just seeing who can come up with an interesting way to tell the story again, more than something brand new. There are a few, like J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter. Harry Potter's story was told before, but not with such skill, you know. And so I think it depends. It's more along those lines there.
Of course, to a kid, every book is
fresh.
First time.
Very right. Yeah, and I find that as a middle-aged man now who reads children's literature, that it's harder for me to find something that will keep my interest because I've read it all before. And so when I do find one, like Wonder, for example, I'm trying to remember the title, The Unlikely Hero of Room 13B, I think that might be it. It's about a boy who has OCD, and it's a very heartbreaking story because you're in his head, and he has a obsession group that he belongs to, and at one point he has to go through rituals to get into his house, like he has to tap the doorknob 3 times or whatever, and he screws up the ritual, and so he's stranded outside of his house. And it's characters like that when I find them, I'm excited about it. Oh, here's a story, here's an angle of the story I hadn't seen before, and then I want to tell everybody about it.
In kids' books, young children's literature, we kind of talked about this. You get older, the pictures aren't as important. You can just read a book with no pictures, and it carries you through. Mm-hmm. But we have the Newbery and the Caldecott, mm-hmm. because we're rewarding both the writing and the illustration.
Right. Mm-hmm.
How important do you think that is in a kid book that it has both?
Well, graphic novels. Let's talk about graphic novels, which has both. Graphic novels, like expanded comic books, are extremely popular right now, and they're again. Some people think it's dumbed down literature. Well, the kids are not using their imagination because the pictures are there. But we learn that where the story leaves off, the pictures continue to tell the story, and kids have to. They have to encode the book a little bit differently, where they're taking the two into play at the same time. It almost slows down the process. It's in frames, and you have to supply what happened between one frame and the other as well. So books like Roller Girl that are now, Raina Telgemeier is a very popular graphic book author-illustrator for middle school girls right now. Her books Drama and Smile and Sisters are extremely popular. So is that hook. My colleague Ned Gannon across the river, I just went over to his studio last week and saw a work in progress where he's coming up with a wordless graphic novel, which is mind-blowing about all the things that are going on. And so I wish him success in getting that one published. I want everybody to be able to see that. And it's kind of an all-ages type of book as well. The Caldecott Award is a recognition for the illustrator. A lot of those are becoming out with more sophistication now. A lot of wonderful works there too. The Newbery Award, I was on that committee several years ago too, looks just at the text itself. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they work differently apart. They all are part of the bigger package of what makes a kid a literate person.
Okay, and I'm curious about this because doesn't a kid have pictures in the head? Isn't part of this imagination process is that the words turn into pictures? Is it better to have the pictures? Is it strengthen that kind of imagination to not have the pictures? What does science say about how those work? I mean, is one better than the other? Are they equal? They do different things?
For some kids, the way they encode a text with pictures is the way they prefer to do it. And so if that installs a love of reading for them, I would let them go with that. There are some resources out there. There's this state of Wisconsin has a wonderful resource called the Cooperative Children's Book Center. If you just do CCBC at UW-Madison, Google that, you'll come up with a wonderful, unique library resource, and they will have a section on graphic novels there that kind of talk about that whole connection, the importance of why illustrations help children learn stories, enjoy stories. And then there are those kids, and a lot of them are my students, who think that get rid of the pictures altogether, let me do the work. So it's different camps, different options for kids, so we don't pigeonhole everybody as the same type of reader.
I'm going to ask you, I'm pretty much done with my questions that I can think of, and I'm going to ask you if you want to add anything else. But before I do that, I want to ask you, in the story of your life, how would you like to be known and remembered?
I think as someone who got kids to laugh. When I was a librarian, it was easy for me to be able to go to schools and have kids come to the library, and I shared stories with them, I shared jokes, and I made them laugh. And I wanted them to associate that with books in the libraries. Kind of a subtle way to make them lifelong readers, lifelong library users. So I'd like to be remembered as somebody that kind of helped other kids go down that path. I have been flattered when I have someone come up to me and say, I went into the library field because you were my librarian when I was younger. So
yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Compliment. Thanks. Anything else you want to add about this?
I can go on forever about children's books, mostly just kind of pointing out what's the really good ones that are out there right now.
What's hot for 2017? You got an example laying around?
Well, I do for young adult. It's called Hate You Give, and the author's name, it's a first-time book, first debut author, and it has to do with gun violence right now, and it's a wonderful perspective of African American white relationships and violence.
Okay. Any others you think of?
I'm trying to think of picture books right now. I just read one called Wolf's First Howling for little kids now. Wolf's First Howling, and again, I can't remember who wrote it right offhand, but a little wolf goes with his dad to practice that first howl, and Dad demonstrates the howl, and the wolf goes, okay, I'm howling right now. And Dad goes, okay, but you don't have to tell me you're howling, just howl. And Dad demonstrates again, and the wolf howls, and the wolf starts bebopping and scatting. And Dad goes, all right, here's how you do it. He demonstrates a true wolf howl again. And the little wolf tries again, and he's bebopping and everything. And then finally the dad gets into it as well. And the book ends with the wolf goes, I can't wait to tell everybody. And the dad says, they already know. So that was a recent treasure I found. And my first thought was, oh, I can't wait to read this to my grandkids, so I could start howling and bebopping as well.
Isn't that the part of the thing that it's as much joy for an adult to read to a kid and to watch them light up?
It should be. It should be. Something's wrong if that's not happening. Yeah. Don't think of it as a chore. Think of it as a fun thing.
Rob, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for Microscope. We've got more on many great topics. Look for us online at www.cvctv.org.